We are tracing the argument through the letter of 1 Timothy. Let's have a look at the argument in 1 Timothy 1, verses 18 to 20. Essentially, the passage is structured around an exhortation in the first half, which is verses 18 and the first half of verse 19, and then an alternative presented in the rest of the passage. In other words, Paul is charging Timothy to do something, to remain something, and then he is driving home that charge by presenting its opposite, somebody who didn't do the thing that he's charging Timothy to do. So he says, this charge, referring to the charge he gave him at the beginning of the chapter, I entrust to you, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies previously made about you, that, and Yari drives home the point of the charge, that by them you may wage the good warfare, holding faith and a good conscience. And then he contrasts that by pointing to people who, like Timothy, were leaders who failed to do this very thing, holding on to faith and a good conscience by rejecting this, and he'll point to some who haven't done it. Let's see how this is unfolded in some more detail. So first, there's an action. This charge I entrust to you, Timothy, in accordance with the prophecies made about you. So the action is Paul charging Timothy. He's charging him something. And then there's a purpose. The purpose of the charge is that by these prophecies he may wage the good warfare. In other words, he may fight the good fight of remaining faithful to Christ in ministry, holding on to faith and a good conscience. If we unpack this a little further even, there's an exhortation. Timothy, keep this charge that I gave you in verse 3. Keep this charge. Be faithful to it. And then he gives the ground of the charge. It's based on the prophecies that were made about him. It's in keeping with what God had told him he needs to do. And then similarly for the action, by them you may wage the good warfare, which results in retaining faith and a good conscience. So one can go about ministry without necessarily retaining faith and a good conscience. It might be tempting for Timothy to take small shortcuts, even justifying it on the grounds that the end justifies the means. I take these shortcuts and but I'm doing it for the good purpose, that I can help people to remain faithful. Paul says to him, no. You wage the good warfare, but you do it by holding on to faith and a good conscience. For the remainder, he illustrates this by presenting the alternative. In other words, there are some who have rejected this. What is this? Faith and a good conscience. And by rejecting it, they have shipwrecked their faith. That's a generic statement. So there are some undefined people, some vaguely known people who haven't held on to faith and a good conscience, and in the process they've shipwrecked their faith. But now Paul moves from generic to specific. He says among them, so not only the ones he's going to name, but among them are two people, Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I've handed over to Satan that they may learn not to blaspheme. Why does he name these two people? It's very likely that they were leaders in the Ephesian church where Timothy was serving. They, like Timothy, were shepherds. They were ministers of the gospel, but they had neglected to keep the charge that Paul gives Timothy and to hold on to faith and a good conscience. So it's not a hypothetical caution for Paul. He's genuinely concerned that his true son in the faith remains faithful. And we can unpack these specifics in some more detail. There's a situation. So there's a situation that says there are some people called Hymenaeus and Alexander who have shipwrecked their faith. Paul's response to that is he says, I've handed them over to Satan that they may learn not to blaspheme. What is this language of handing them over to Satan? It means to put them out of the church. Not literally handing them over to Satan, but putting them out of the sphere where God's protection is experienced, and metaphorically putting them into Satan's realm by putting them out of the church. So this is Paul's response to the situation of ministers of the gospel who cease to retain faith and a good conscience. He hands them over to Satan. Why does he do that? Well, his purpose is redemptive. The purpose is that they may learn not to blaspheme. So in a nutshell, friends, that is the structure of 1 Timothy 1, verses 18 to 20. Paul charges Timothy to wage the good warfare, to keep the charge that he's given him, but to do it while retaining faith and a good conscience. And then to illustrate that this is a real danger for a minister of the gospel, he points to Hymenaeus and Alexander, who had allowed their faith to be shipwrecked through not attending to this very priority.